You first, yeah.
Okay. So earlier you were talking about exponential price depreciation, and I was wondering what sort of tools can we use to ameliorate the socially disruptive effects of that when the nanofabrication revolution actually happens? I mean, the negative effects being massive unemployment, institutionalization, becoming obsolete, thousands of people with no idea what to do for government or commerce.
How can we ameliorate the social upheaval that arises from post-industrial revolution based on nanofabrication?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Iron-fisted totalitarian dictatorship, maybe? Workers' paradise? I don't know. I don't. I'm sorry.
I'll put you down right.
Right. Yeah.
So For the Win, and to some extent even in Little Brother, you had these very, pretty small, technologically savvy networks sparking almost popular revolution among a much less sophisticated group of people who were waiting for something to happen.
Right.
Enslaved factory workers and whatnot ought to do something about their conditions, but often don't. Is that actually, I guess, is that going to happen? Is that all it takes? Is it really just a matter of having, a few thousand people who are really well connected to trigger these things?
I think there's lots of social scientists who would say that that is the case, right? That oftentimes that technical knowledge. So it's not. So I would take slight exception to this because it's not really about a small group of people who use technology to liberate a larger group of people. It's about a small group of people who know something about technology that rapidly diffuses through a larger group of people who help themselves. And I think that that's pretty characteristic of a lot of technological diffusion, right? That you've got a large group of people who have a problem, and one person in that group whose kind of social circle overlaps with a different group that has some technical know-how, imports that knowledge, and then it diffuses really quickly, right? If you have, for example, a large expatriate community that spends a lot of money on telecommunications, and then someone comes along with free long-distance service through something like Skype, Skype diffuses really quickly. I remember one of the engineers who worked on Hotmail telling me that they saw this enormous growth curve in Hotmail, which was really the first widespread free email service. After they saw a couple of emails go from North America to India essentially through the diaspora. Essentially you can imagine their payload was, I found some free email, right? And then they saw this enormous uptake. And it's not because people are incapable of helping themselves, it's just the reverse. It's that once people know some appropriate technological stuff, they're able to help themselves.
And why doesn't that go both ways? Why don't the sort of forces of totalitarianism or whatever the villain might be, have the same thing apply?
Well, I think it does, right? I think that what technology is really good at is not liberating people or enslaving people, but disrupting the status quo. Because technology gives advantage to people who want to undermine something that's stable. Back to your question, if you can imagine a kind of security scenario for the Middle Ages where we've just invented earth-moving technology, and you want to defend a city with earth-moving technology, so you build a big wall around it, and I want to break into the city with earth-moving technology. You need to build a perfect wall. I need to find one imperfection. Your task is exponentially harder than my task, right? So I think that when you look at Orwell, you look at 1984, he comes across as kind of a technophobe, and I think that what he was seeing was a little piece of the arc of technology, where technology had realized an old totalitarian dream, right? Where there had been states previously that had asserted total control over the individual private lives of the people who lived in them, but they couldn't actually make that a reality until technology gave them a little assist. And Orwell, I think, looked at that and said, aha, this is what technology does. Technology helps authoritarians assert their authority. But not long thereafter, at least on glacial timescales, you had things like samizdat, where technology was being used to undermine the state, right? So, and today, I think we're living in another one of those kind of inflection points where we went from technology as a liberating force during my adolescence, where it gave young people capacity to access tools and ideas and communities that even the most powerful and rich grown-ups couldn't have dreamt of. And now it's turned into everybody's kid gets an iPhone that has an app built into it that essentially tracks them like they were a felon with an ankle cuff, right? And every library is mandated to put spyware on their computers, and every school puts spyware on their computers, and students who are caught using proxies or any other tool that might enhance their privacy are thrown out of school, and then at the same time their educators spend all their time chiding them for not caring about their privacy enough and putting their information on Facebook, never noticing the gap between deed and action. And what I hope for is that we'll get another swing of the pendulum. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you what books are you reading or have you been reading in the last year that have really expanded your point of view about something?
Yeah.
And then a separate question, I wondered if you could talk about what happened with Peter Watts and like how
Sure.
that went down.
Sure. Okay. So what books have I read lately that I really like? Well, there's a few books that are coming out that I've read in galleys that I really enjoyed. One is Kevin Kelly, who was the one of the founding editors of Wired and had edited the Whole Earth Review and started the Whole Earth Electronic, like The Well, which was an old conferencing system. Has a new book out called coming out called What Technology Wants, that I think is one of the most insightful nonfiction books about technology I've read in a long time. I find myself quoting it a lot. And it's cool because only I get to quote it because it's not out and I read it. So, in terms of fiction, I've read a couple of really good novels that are coming out shortly. One is by Kathy Koja, who you might know as a young adult writer before Koja, and before she was a young adult writer, she was a horror writer. And a really well-loved and respected one. She wrote these very lavish, kind of darkly erotic horror novels, and then started writing these very spare, slender young adult novels that were completely as like chalk and cheese, as different as you can imagine. She's gone back to writing adult fiction. She's written a book called Under the Poppy that's another one of these very dark, horrific, erotic novels, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's like vintage Koja. I can't say enough good things about it. And then the other book that I've read recently that's coming out in the next year or so is Joe Walton, who's a British writer who lives in Canada, has a book coming out called Among Others, also from Tor. It's a fictionalized memoir of her life growing up in Wales. So she was a twin, and her sister was killed in a car accident that they were both in when she was a child that left her with a cane and a limp for her whole life. And she was sent off. Her mom was quite mad, and she was sent off to live with her father, who sent her to a posh girls' school. So that part's true, and she's written that into the story. And at this posh girls' school, she discovered science fiction. She discovered a science fiction reading group in the town, and it opened her horizons, changed her life forever, made her into a writer. The part that's fictionalized is that she can do magic. And she can do a kind of magic that involves never knowing whether or not it's really magic or not, where she does these things that seem to influence the reality around her, and you're never sure whether she's kidding herself or not. But the reason that her sister died in this car accident is the two of them were working some magic to protect them from their mother, who's a very terrible person. And so this kind of fictionalized and memoir elements kind of blend in together in a way that's seamless and unlike any other book I've ever read. It's spectacular. About Peter Watts, well, Peter Watts is a science fiction writer from Canada and a friend of mine, and he drove a friend to the United States to help them move, and he was driving back, and he was near the border. He wasn't actually at the border, and he was at like a toll plaza, I think, and a customs guard not at the border, a U.S. customs guard, went and opened his trunk and started looking in it. And he got out and he said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Get back in your car, sir." And he said, "I want to know what's going on." And at that point, they maced him and beat him up and rolled him in the snow. He's in a t-shirt. And then they threw him in a cell with no heat, in a blizzard, in a t-shirt that was soaked through. They held him overnight. They charged him with a felony, which was obstruction and also assault. It turns out that the obstruction statute's really broadly worded. It's a state statute in Michigan, and all it says is if you don't immediately comply with any lawful order, you are guilty of obstruction. Like literally immediately. Like if they say jump and you don't frog, you're obstructing. And so he was convicted on the obstruction charge, but the judge gave him a suspended sentence. So he can't ever travel to the U.S. again. He'll probably have trouble traveling to other countries, and he is a felon. And he did have to pay a lot of money in legal fees. We raised a lot of money for him online, about $60,000, but that wasn't enough ultimately to cover all of his legal charges. As a science fiction writer, you know, there are very few science fiction writers who write commercial fiction who live in Canada who can function without going to the US for conferences or meeting with their editors and so on. So it's going to be really tricky. He's got another career to fall back on. He's actually Dr. Peter Watts. He's got a PhD in marine biology, and he's a working biologist. So, but it's pretty awful.